Okay.
Hi, I'm Pastor Mike Grobelch of Peace Lutheran Church, and today we're going to begin a study on the Book of Ruth. And I would like to start with a brief introduction and some background of the book. Ruth was King David's great-grandmother, which means, in essence, she is an ancestor of Jesus Christ. Now, the book was written during the time of Judges, and that is all the information that we have to pinpoint it. It doesn't give us any judge that was in power at that time. So the best we can do is a range. We have a number of characters. Boaz is a model rich man, and his action, every action in fact, shows his deep faith in God. We have Ruth, whose modesty and patience also reflects a deep faith in God. In fact, Ruth was a Moabitess. She was a person of Moab. And it shows that Gentiles could enter into the chosen people by believing in the covenant that God had made with the Jews. And Naomi, her fidelity to her duties shows a deep-seated belief. Now, who wrote Ruth? Good question. And frankly, I don't have an answer for you. Scholars have argued this over the years, and none has come back and say it's got to be X or Y. In fact, some have postulated that the author is King David himself because the book ends in the genealogy of David. There's also another group of scholars that says that customs referenced in chapter 4 and chapter 7, and we will address those in those chapters, may indicate a later author. We don't know. At this point, we do know that it was during the time of Judges that the Book of Ruth was written. Beyond that, we can't say with any certainty. Let's begin with chapter 1, and we're going to take it in 5-verse chunks. And Ruth 1 starts out, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Ephraimites of Benjamin in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Amalek, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Both Mahan and Chalon also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. The time of Ruth is roughly, again, we're talking ranges, about 150 years before King David. The famine that is talked about is one that is promised by God if his people strayed from worshiping the true God and took up idol worship. Now, one of the interesting things is that this family of Jews took refuge in Moab, as Moab was an ancient enemy of the Israelites. In fact, they had been, other sources tell us that grain shipments had been coming into Israel, and we can postulate that they were probably being cut off by the Philistines. Now, the first calamity that occurs to this family is when the husband dies in a foreign land. And when we look at verse 4, for example, the 2 sons took Moabite women as wives, which is in direct contradiction to what God had commanded. Listen to what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning in verse 2. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet with you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Now, this is a real interesting thing, because hospitality was a huge part of the ancient Mideast culture, and not to meet these people who were in need, who were fleeing an oppressive government. They should have been met with food and water, and yet the Moabites did not. And God has since said, I am going to curse you. And one of the things that curse says, you can't join that people which I have chosen to be a blessing to all the nations. And so we see that we have Naomi in Moab without sons to support her and without a husband to support her. Now, not having neither husband or sons, nor property, nor were there any grandchildren, this is one of the most cursed things that could happen to this woman. She had no support net. She had no safety net. When the way things worked in the ancient Middle East is that when people became old, they couldn't work anymore, their family, their sons, their daughters, and even grandchildren would take care of them, until the end of their lives. Now, here this woman was left. She had no sons. She had no husband. And one thing that we can take a look at here is sometimes God will give us a cross, or give his children a cross, in order to bind them more securely to himself. And, we can take a look at today's situation and say, doesn't that sort of apply to us? We are sitting here in the midst of a quarantine. We are getting restless. We're getting anxious. What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen with our jobs? What's going to happen to those people that we know are sick? Are they going to survive? What's going to happen? And I don't know about you, but I find myself turning more and more to God. More prayer, more time talking with him, and I find a great comfort in that time, and hopefully you will too. Now, as we go on into a little bit further into chapter 1, we read the next 5 verses. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-laws with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed him, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And then they said to her, "No, but we will surely return to you, with you to your people." Normally, the daughters-in-laws would go only a short distance with her, perhaps just to the edge of the territory of Moab. And what is interesting is that Naomi asked for God to have mercy on these 2 women. God had mercy on his people because the famine was over. But Naomi asked that her 2 daughters-in-law have mercy on them. And she was sending them off to the traditional refuge of young widows, back to their families. And she asked that God bless these 2 daughters-in-law because they had dealt kindly and graciously with Naomi during this time. This relationship of these 2 formerly heathen women is something to model. It's based on mercy, grace, and these 2 women showered grace on Naomi when they could have equally done something else. Now, in verse 9, we see that Naomi asked that they may be blessed in a second marriage. And the kiss that she bestows on them is a symbol of, now it is time for you to leave to begin your journey. And yet, both daughter-in-laws choose to stay with Naomi, which is highly unusual. They are, in essence, leaving their families and going into a place that they are strangers. They are not native to Judah. They are Moabite women, and yet they choose to go with Naomi. And this is one of the things that we will be picking up, one of the themes that we'll be picking up a little bit later in our study. But you see here that things aren't what they appear to be. These daughters-in-law should have gone back to their families, and they didn't. Naomi should have been in a really bad spot, but yet here, these 2 women, these 2 formerly heathen women, were uplifting her and supporting her both physically and morally in her time of need. And that is something that we all can do. Over the next week, when the next installment of this study comes out, think about how you can help your neighbors. Maybe it's remember to be a little extra, give them a little extra grace or kindness this week. Certainly it can't hurt, and it can only help, especially at this time. During this next week, I pray that God blesses you and keeps you in his hands until next time, where once again we can gather around and study his word. Thank you for joining this study. God bless, and I'll see you next time.